But we need to hold our senior military leaders accountable for their activism. And we're not, as long as their activism is radical left-wing activism. We need to hold them accountable, and we need elected officials who are interested in being serious about this and holding them accountable for their activism. Otherwise, we'll lose our military. Several weeks ago, I received a phone call from a Politico reporter called Oriana Pollock. She was calling to ask my reaction to the adjudication of a recent Air Force Inspector General's office investigation that was ongoing over Lieutenant General Stephen Whiting. He had been found not guilty of any wrongdoing in my firing from command back in May of 2021, which did not surprise me. I recognized Oriana Pollock's name. She was the same reporter that called me on May 14th, 2021, when I was in my car driving to my boss's office to be fired. And she was calling to find out what my reaction was to having been fired. She was at the time a military.com reporter. And it was clear to me, since I hadn't yet been notified myself, that Space Force leadership, or Space Force Public Affairs, had been coordinating the release of a story that would then make national headlines that I was being fired because the Space Force had allegedly lost its trust and confidence in my ability to lead, and it was alleged that I had acted in a politically partisan manner while acting in an official capacity, which, to this day, I disagree with and deny. But Oriana Pollock had apparently worked with the military to break that story, told her that she had called just a bit too soon, and so we spoke after I had been fired. Well, I hadn't heard from her since May of 2021 until just several weeks ago, when she called to ask what my response was or what my thoughts were about the result of the investigation of Lieutenant General Whiting. So I agreed to chat with her by phone, shared with her my thoughts, and by email a couple of days later, she explained that she'd only be publishing a small part of our conversation in her story that she was doing, and that she didn't have the space to include all of it. And I said that was fine. I'm starting a podcast soon, and I'll take every last bit of opportunity I need to share publicly then information that sometimes the news or media, journals, journalists, reporters aren't interested in reporting. So today, I will read something to you, and I won't always read to you. It's something that's important that I think you'll be interested in. It's something that I've not had the opportunity to this point to share in detail publicly, because there's just never enough time in either soundbite media interviews or even in long-form interviews that I've done with various media personalities, even if they're very good at what they do. There's just never enough time. The benefit of having my own show is that I get to talk about things at length in the way that I'd like to talk about them, and ask the questions I'd like to ask, and answer those questions with as much time as I need. Sometimes on this show, I'll fly solo and take 30 or 40 minutes to develop an idea that I'm interested in talking about, and it won't always be politics-driven or military-centric. In fact, much of the time it might not be. But some of the time it will be, and I think in these first few episodes, it's important that I set some of the record straight, lay out some information that I can then hereafter always point back to. And so for today, what you'll get to hear is important context for my having written the book Irresistible Revolution, which has the subtitle Marxism's Goal of Conquest and the Unmaking of the American Military. It is for that book and speaking about it publicly that I was relieved of command on May 14th, 2021, and subsequently was thrust into a national spotlight, not by my own choosing, but because of that very article that was written by Oriana Pollock back in May of 2021. And as some of you may be aware, although I wouldn't be surprised if many of you don't know much about my story, I have had the opportunity to do a number of media appearances since separating from active duty in September 2021. I've been on a speaking circuit around the country and make it to many cities in which I get to share some of this story, but certainly not all of it. And so for what it's worth, I'd like to read to you this important document dated 18 November 2020. This is a formal written complaint that I filed in November of 2020 about political activism that I was seeing at my base. I will omit the names of individuals involved. I've never intended to be vindictive, and I'm still not intending to hurt people's careers, although activists should be held accountable for political activism within the military. The subject of this memorandum is fair and equal treatment of individuals at Buckley Air Force Base, Colorado. Again, I'm going to omit the names of some of the individuals involved for their privacy, but you will get in detail the complaint that I filed with the Space Force Inspector General's office. And then over the next several episodes, we'll talk about the response to this complaint. I'll also get into some details about my own career and background and what it is that I've been doing since separating from active duty. And then hopefully we'll move on from some of this ugly discussion to other topics that greatly interest me, things that I tend to spend most of my time thinking about or reading about. Paragraph 1. So-and-so, garrison commander at Buckley Air Force Base, Colorado, has unethically used his position to promote anti-American propaganda to the military personnel at his base. The ideologically driven narrative he espouses, which is rooted in critical race theory, is engendering division and resentment within the ranks, undermining good order and discipline, and eroding the confidence military professionals place in their oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. Paragraph 2. Under the banner of diversity and inclusion, this divisive agenda has continued at Buckley Garrison despite the Office of Management and Budget's memorandums dated 4 September 2020 and 28 September 2020, see Attachment 1. The President's Executive Order dated 22 September 2020, see Attachment 2. And the Defense Department's Memorandum on Implementation of the Executive Order dated 16 October 2020, see Attachment 3, otherwise banning such trainings. Some of the trainings at Buckley Garrison are racist and hostile and undermining our obligation to ensure the fair and equal treatment of all individuals before the law. The present memorandum summarizes only some of what I have witnessed since arriving at Buckley in June 2020 and is not an effort to be exhaustive. Further, it details occurrences both preceding and succeeding the aforementioned executive order and memorandums. I point out that my experience is not unique and that other leaders and military personnel have discussed with me their concerns over the climate at the base, but that they are unsure how to address the problem. I add in here, they're unsure how to address the problem because there had been a climate of fear that's been generated within our Defense Department. Paragraph 3. On 24 June 2020, shortly after I moved to Buckley, the base commander sent an email containing anti-American, progressive political propaganda to the members of his base, see Attachment 4. He requested that members, comprised of both Air and Space Force personnel, view 2 propaganda videos to the upcoming Buckley Connects Virtual Wingman Day. The 2 videos were The Uncomfortable Truth, Amazon Prime 2017 by Loki Mulholland, and 13th, Netflix, 2016. They contain at least the following inappropriate and concerning elements. And remember, by the way, this isn't an academic setting and class at a university. We're talking about your taxpayer-funded military bases where we have military missions that we should be accomplishing, and an oath to support and defend and uphold the Constitution of the United States. Paragraph 3A. The uncomfortable truth portrays American history as fraught with racism from 1619 till the present. It teaches that a racist social order was codified by the U.S. Constitution to allow whites to remain in power and subjugate and oppress blacks, and that we have never escaped from that foundation of racism. That upon ratification of the Constitution, quote, white supremacy was now the official policy of the United States of America, unquote. Paragraph 3B. 13th portrays Republican politicians as racist, claiming, for example, that George Bush won his election by causing Americans to fear black people, and also showing clips of Donald Trump before the 2016 election that cast him in a negative light, insinuating that he has fueled systemic racism in America. The video also portrays Democrats as aiding the black community. For example, favorable clips are shown of Barack Obama and Bill and Hillary Clinton, and interviews of famous Marxist activist Melina Abdullah, Black Lives Matter Los Angeles chapter organizer and activist, in order to build a suitably unfavorable narrative about American history in order to justify and demonstrate sympathy for violent riots specifically. The United States is referred to as a, quote, system of oppression throughout the film. The President of the United States, at the time Donald Trump, is cast in a terrible light and out of context at 1 hour, 20 minutes, 15 seconds to imply that he enjoys oppressing blacks and keeping minorities in an inferior status. As a commander of young military personnel, all of whom have taken the oath to support and defend the Constitution, I am very concerned, this is my language, that group identity politics and anti-American propaganda is eroding the trust and confidence these young people have in their country and in the Constitution. This same ideology has, in various forums, continued to be promulgated throughout my time at the base. Let me interject here and ask the listener, if you were in command of a unit at a military base at which such propaganda was being pushed on the active duty service members at your base, do you believe that you would have an obligation to identify this to your chain of command? Do you believe that doing such a thing, that is, using your chain of command, or filing a formal written complaint about this propaganda, should be viewed as political partisanship, or should it be viewed instead as a part of your duty or your obligation as a commander to protect the morale and the good order and discipline of your people and your unit? Paragraph 4. On Friday, 26 June 2020, the base hosted the Buckley Connects Virtual Wingman Day, during which conversations on race, respect, and healing took place. The stated goal of the event was to create safe spaces to discuss race and seek racial healing. See Attachment 5. Statements were read at the beginning of small group discussions to generate conversation. It was suggested to facilitators of these group discussions to read the following statements. Quote, police in America are more suspicious of certain people based on their race. And, quote, I believe racism is prevalent in our country and in the Air Force. Participants were asked to write whether they agreed with the statements and to share their responses with the group. Once participants were, quote, more comfortable, they were directed to, quote, get serious and deepen the conversation using at least 3 of the following questions. Quote, how often do you think about your racial or ethnic identity? Quote, what aspect of your racial or ethnic identity makes you the proudest? Quote, In what ways does being your specific race or ethnicity impact your personal and your professional life? Does racial or ethnic identity enter in your process of making important or daily decisions? Quote, have you ever felt different in a group setting because of your race or ethnicity? How did this affect you? How often or deeply do you interact with people of a different racial or ethnic identity other than your own? Quote, have you ever witnessed someone being treated unfairly because of their racial or ethnic identity? In the Air Force? If so, how did you respond? How did it make you feel? Quote, what do you think needs to happen before our country can achieve healing and forgiveness? What can we do locally? What can we do in the Air Force? It was hoped that these discussions would, quote, provide opportunities to acknowledge the tremendous damage inflicted by individual and systemic racism and lead participants to become oriented toward equity. These statements and questions imply that certain ideas are a foregone conclusion, thereby subtly coercing participants into acquiescence or simply shaming them into silence. The climate created by these discussions leads participants to feel that if they disagree, they are likely to be viewed as racist, or part of the problem, or as getting political. I'm halfway through. What will you do if the grid goes down? How will you survive without food, water, and heat? Introducing One Sunrise, the first of its kind in massive on-demand power, instantly available at any residential, commercial, or remote location. Power your home, your office, your EV, your RV, your farm, your cabin, your bug-out bunker, your glamping weekend with the family, or all of them. Bring instant power to any situation, anywhere. Non-toxic, cobalt and lead-free, as well as fire-resistant, One Sunrise mobile power stations are made to run in over 100-degree temps or at -20. For when the grid goes down, there's One Sunrise. Visit onesunrise.com to learn how you can prepare today for no power tomorrow. Paragraph 5. Around the same time, other guidance in the form of emails, town halls, Facebook Live events, discussion guidelines, and talking points was disseminated to help leaders on the base facilitate ongoing conversations about racial injustice and inequity in the country and in the service. One such tool that was sent to leaders, titled Difficult Conversations, Racial and Ethnic Diversity, see Attachment 6, discussed the importance in, quote, establishing a safe and courageous environment within your workplace, unquote, in order to minimize discomfort in discussions about race. Leaders were also cautioned, however, that, quote, for some airmen and space professionals, particularly members of marginalized non-majority or targeted identity groups, you may not be able to provide complete safety. The implication, of course, was that the military workplace is not already a safe environment for minorities, and that identity groups play a fundamental role in military organizational culture and identity, which is absolutely false, by the way. It's absolutely false. In the over 15 years I spent on active duty, I have very rarely seen discrimination based on race or ethnicity, or any other reason for that matter, taking place in our armed forces. And where it occurs, there is swift accountability. Paragraph 6. Emails about race and racism from various base agencies, including from the base commander, continued to go to base personnel during the months of June and July 2020. In one such email from so-and-so, he asked leaders to read an article written by Daisy Auger Dominguez, the Chief People Officer at Vice Media Group and Vice Chair of the Board of Directors of Planned Parenthood Federation, titled Getting Over Your Fear of Talking About Diversity, which he attached to his email, see Attachment 7. The article suggests leaders read certain books to educate themselves about, quote, issues of women, people of color, people with disabilities, LGBTQ plus issues, religious minorities, and other marginalized groups, unquote. The books recommended included Ijeoma Oluo's So You Want to Talk About Race, Minda Hart's The Memo, What Women of Color Need to Know to Secure a Seat at the Table, Jody Patterson's The Bold World, and Dolly choose the person you mean to be, how good people fight bias. The article further instructs leaders to apologize and admit your mistakes, and to take up the work as an ally in a position of power, and to launch team conversations about white fragility, holding all-hands meetings calling out racially charged incidents when they happen, or introducing yourself with your pronouns. Paragraph 7. In July 2020, so-and-so suggested that the base community support coordinator compile a list of diversity and inclusion initiatives, specifically book clubs, small group discussions, and so forth, that have been implemented by the various units on the base so that such initiatives might be, quote, shared with everyone, see Attachment 8. In a 10 July email solicitation of those initiatives, it was advertised that the Buckley Chapel team was developing its own discussion groups. The first topic to be discussed was valuing people. The chapel explained that, quote, we will do so by watching a video on racism that documents generational and political racism, followed by a facilitated discussion on racism. I later came to learn from young enlisted space professionals in my own unit, as well as from a chaplain, that the chapel had also established minority small group discussions and classes titled Race in America that were available to everyone. 12 days later, a follow-up email was sent by the community support coordinator to base leaders containing a consolidated list of diversity and inclusion initiatives. Among them, the base Force Support Squadron shared that they were giving their enlisted members, quote, homework to research issues related to race in America, and that they would be discussing their homework bi-weekly at enlisted calls to, quote, keep the discussion on race and respect a constant topic in the squadron, unquote. These are merely a couple of examples of initiatives, among others, being organized at Buckley Garrison. I know this is somewhat tedious reading through the entire complaint, but I think you'll agree with me after having listened to it that it's absolutely critical information. And we're going to talk about what the response to this complaint was. All of this took place before I ever considered writing a book. All of it took place before I ever penned the first sentence of the first chapter of my book. Paragraph 8. In July 2020, shortly after I took command, a chaplain and another from the chapel stopped by my office to introduce themselves. Then Squadron Superintendent, so-and-so, was in my office at the time of the brief introduction. The chaplain explained that it was no longer the chapel's practice to give office space to their chaplains over in the chapel, that was how the chapel used to do things, but that the chaplains were now expected to live amongst and be embedded in the units they served. The chaplain explained that another squadron commander had already provided him an office space within that squadron, and that he, the chaplain, was also interested in finding office space within my unit, the 11th Space Warning Squadron. You see, by the way, these are details that most of the people in the unit that I was in command of have never heard before. Some of them may have heard it by now, but not from me. Only those who were in leadership positions in my unit knew these things were taking place. And that he, the chaplain, was also interested in finding office space within my unit, the 11th Space Warning Squadron. He also explained his intent to share the Race in America classes or lectures with members of my unit. I explained to him that I was on my way out the door, kindly expressed hesitation at his proposal, and said that I would like to sit down with him at some point soon to meet him and learn more about the classes. The chaplain seemed surprised at my hesitation and pursued the issue further. Surprised by his insistence, I respectfully explained that this was an operations squadron, that we have a mission to accomplish, that there was no greater advocate of the important role of the chaplaincy than me, but that there was also a proper balance between operations and chaplain support that I was interested in finding. At that, he said, quote, I have heard about commanders like you, but I've never met one. While I cannot know for sure what was meant by the chaplain's statement, I considered it a jab, as I'm sure you can understand. The comment seemed intended to convey the chaplain's dismay at my reluctance to readily welcome his classes, about which I knew very little at the time, into my squadron. The chaplain has a friendly demeanor, and though his statement was not said with an angry tone, I could not help but perceive he viewed me as an opponent to what he was pursuing, and it left me concerned about our interaction. I do not know if our initial conversation was shared with others. My superintendent was present for the entirety of our brief visit. Paragraph 9. On Wednesday, 12 August 2020 at 1400, that's 2 p.m., the chaplain sat down with me and my superintendent in my office to discuss the contents of the Race in America classes. The conversation lasted for about an hour and 15 minutes. The chaplain explained that the classes were intended to facilitate dialogue on how we can heal as a nation and as a service and overcome systemic racism. I asked him what he meant by systemic racism. He replied with an unclear vignette skirting the issue somewhat, and then replied, after brief hesitation, quote, "Basically, whites are racist." I told him I did not believe such a problem existed in our country or within our service, and explained to him why I thought such a message not only had no healing power, but that I was concerned it would create division and unhealthy tension between the members of my unit. We had much dialogue over these issues, which for the most part was professional and respectful despite our opposite views. The chaplain shared many views which gave me cause for concern. Among the most alarming to me were his views that the United States was founded by racists, that American history was written by a white oppressor class that was racist, and that, quote, history must be rewritten. I again expressed concern over his views. I explained to him that to impugn guilt to members of my unit solely based on the color of their skin was the very definition of racism. I expressed concern that the narrative he had chosen to adopt about American history was fueled by a divisive political ideology that was dangerous. He, of course, disagreed. I also explained to him that his narrative on race in American history undermined the trust that our service members place in their oath to support and defend the Constitution. He disagreed. Paragraph 10. In September 2020, an active duty black female enlisted member of my unit came to my office to discuss a concern she had with regards to another male member of the unit. My first sergeant, so-and-so, was present for the conversation. We had a long conversation with the member and took very seriously and investigated her concerns about a statement that she overheard another member of the unit make to his friends, to which she took offense and considered racist. That particular complaint was adjudicated appropriately into the satisfaction of myself, my first sergeant, and the complainant, and is not the issue I would like to address. I continue. During the course of conversation with this female member, she explained, quote, I never knew before that I was an outsider, not just in my country, but in my own service, meaning the Air Force. I never knew about that until I attended the classes at the chapel with the chaplain, unquote. We asked her about the classes, and she explained that she had been attending a minority group discussion hosted by the chaplain, at which they were discussing issues of race in America. It was clear to the first sergeant and me that this member was being trained to view the motives, statements, and behavior of others as racist. The fact that the member said that she, quote, never knew before, unquote, that she was an outsider, gave us greater cause for concern over the classes that were being hosted by the chaplain. The first sergeant and I were aware of at least one other member of our unit, also a black enlisted member, attending the classes. The classes in question, which plant this divisive, fear-filled, and hate-fueled ideology into the hearts of our active duty members, is not only known about by the garrison commander or base commander, but has his ongoing support and advocacy as is evidenced in his emails to the base, his base resiliency days, his town halls in which he makes occasional mention of these initiatives, and his Team Buckley biweekly tag-up during which he and the chaplain invite others to attend those discussions. Paragraph 11. The garrison commander and the base chapel are sponsoring a Discussions on Race book club at which critical race theory is taught. The first such discussion took place on Thursday, 29 October 2020, which I attended via live stream. It is noted that these discussions are being facilitated long after the executive order was issued, directing government officials to cease training government workers to believe divisive anti-American propaganda, specifically critical race theory. The book discussed at the first event was So You Want to Talk About Race by Ijeoma Oluo, and the discussion was facilitated by an active duty black female officer, member of such and such unit. The book teaches that the United States is a, quote, white supremacist society that must be, quote, dismantled piece by piece. It teaches that speech that makes, quote, people of color feel unsafe is an act of violence, but that if whites are uncomfortable, quote, do not allow them to be treated as if harm has been done to them, unquote. The book suggests ways a reader might want to consider facilitating discussions about the contents of the book, saying, quote, the comfort of white attendees should be very, very far down on the priority list, unquote. Is this what you want happening in your military? Should someone be fired for drawing attention to these issues? Unless it seems this is about me, I'm over this. Personally, I'm over all of this, but we need to hold our senior military leaders accountable for their activism. And we're not, as long as their activism is radical left-wing activism. We need to hold them accountable, and we need elected officials who are interested in being serious about this and holding them accountable for their activism. Otherwise, we'll lose our military. In its suggestions regarding creating safe spaces, the book advocates reintroducing a form of segregation into American society, and in our case, in the military organization. If whites, quote, feel strongly that they need to center their feelings and experiences in the discussion, set up a space away from the group where they can talk with other white people. Do not let it take over the group discussion or become a burden that people of color in the group have to bear, unquote. Can you see why I was having an issue with this being taught at my base? Further, the book emphatically touches upon the many other aspects comprising critical race theory, topics such as privilege, intersectionality, police brutality, cultural appropriation, and microaggressions. The book proposes organizations to which concerned readers should be donating their money, such as the ACLU, Planned Parenthood, and the NAACP. It instructs readers that they should vote for politicians who support raising the minimum wage and who favor police reform. One participant in the group, who mentioned he was currently also reading Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility, expressed how glad he was that the base commander was able to use his bully pulpit to push these discussions on race. Paragraph 12. Since arriving at Buckley, I have heard rumors from at least several unrelated sources that so-and-so is hosting minority-only small group mentorship gatherings at his on-base residence. I have not sought to verify the truthfulness of these rumors, but mention it here because it is related to the other items discussed in the present memorandum, and because the rumors alone have fueled a perception of unfairness for some active duty members at the base. Finally, paragraph 13, and this is the last paragraph of this written complaint. As the President's executive order states, these types of trainings not only run counter to the fundamental beliefs for which our nation has stood since its inception, but they also engender division and resentment within the federal workforce. They do not engender inclusion, but prevent it. As a commander, I am seeing this play out in real time in the military at a breakneck pace. Military members who take an oath to support and defend the Constitution are being trained to hate America's founding, history, and current standing of privilege in the world. Books such as Oluo's and other videos and training materials that have been disseminated and discussed on the base, which are rooted in critical race theory, should have no place in the United States military, yet these trainings and materials were sponsored by the garrison commander and the chaplaincy. The ideology I have described dismisses individuality outright and demonizes entire groups of people, and specifically whites. Further, it pits groups and classes of people against one another, creating a polarized political and social environment, cancels fraternal ties, imagined or real, and undermines our obligation to ensure the fair and equal treatment of all individuals before the law. Signed, Matthew Lohmeyer, Lieutenant Colonel, United States Space Force Commander. Now, as I said at the beginning, the reason I think it's important to share that in its entirety is because I've only ever before shared that piecemeal, in parts, and I've made reference to those things, but I've never read it. Again, I've read it without using the specific names of the individuals involved. Frankly, that doesn't matter to me nearly as much as the idea that we eradicate political activism from our active duty, from the entire Defense Department, from all of our federal agencies, specifically our uniformed services. There is no place for political activism. Unfortunately for me and many others, to speak up against such political activism is to be labeled politically partisan, which is unfair. Our service members are trained well to be apolitical. There are some, however, who, because they are political activists, disregard that training that they've received to be apolitical, and they pursue political activism at the expense of everyone else in the services. So Oriana Pollock from Politico called asking for my response to the finding of the Air Force Inspector General's office that Lieutenant General Stephen Whiting wasn't guilty of any wrongdoing and firing me from my command for being politically partisan. To wrap up this first episode of my show, let me read to you the response that I got back from Lieutenant General Stephen Whiting. I filed that written formal complaint with the Space Force Inspector General's office on 18 November 2021. As a part of that complaint, I listed 24 witnesses at the base, not all of whom would have agreed with my view of events at the base, but those who would have an awareness of things that were going on, such as people at the chapel. And you'll recall that in November, there was something else that was going on in the country. It was a presidential election. And that complaint, which was fielded by Lieutenant General Stephen Whiting, was sat on through November and December and into January. To my knowledge, none of the people that I listed as a witness on that complaint were ever interviewed, to include myself. I was never called. I was never interviewed. I'm not sure how thorough of an investigation one can do if they're not willing to interview the witnesses that are listed on a complaint. And by the way, this is a personal note, and then I'll get past the personal notes. I would have greatly appreciated a phone call or an email acknowledging and expressing some gratitude for my concern over the morale of my forces. But there were politics at play, and there was a climate of fear at play. I got a response the day after the January 6th protest and riots that took place at our nation's capital. The letter is dated January 4th, but I received it the day following January 6th. I won't read it in full, and it's not very long. I'll read to you the first paragraph and the last, because there's a lot of Air Force instructions and DoD instructions and regulations that are referenced in between. Stephen Whiting writes, "Your complaint of 18 November 2020, originally presented to the Space Force Inspector General, was referred to me for review. He says, I have carefully reviewed your allegations and the various matters you offered in support, except for interviewing anyone." Then, at the very end, he says, "After considering all the facts, I have taken appropriate action." Signed, Stephen Whiting, Lieutenant General, United States Space Force Commander. Well, I thought it was important to get those facts straight and to share some of the details contained in my written formal complaint with the Space Force Inspector General's office, which is a great segue into why I ended up writing a book, and I've got a lot more to talk about. If you like what you find here and think it's useful, or have friends or family that you think would find this show interesting, please follow the show on your favorite podcasting and social media platforms, to include Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Rumble, and others. On episode 2, we will pick up with this story right where I've left off, and I'll also share a little bit more about my background in the Air Force and Space Force. Thanks, guys.